This story happened in the year of 1995, when I was 17. I came to a small town in Slovakia expecting to take part in a student workshop. My expectations were very age appropriate. I thought I would suffer through a few lectures and then party with other participants. But the main lecture of the event was a bit different. A guy in his 30s came and started to talk about something he called the information superhighway. He kept explaining how future technologies will bring all the knowledge of the humankind to our fingertips. We all will be interconnected in digital tribes. We will be able to send a message through a computer to a person on another continent in seconds, free of charge. We will all have access to all the research papers, books, visual art, movies, videos, music. All this will make humankind better and will guarantee peace and prosperity and wisdom. I found all that hard to believe. I mean, send a message through a computer to a person on another continent in seconds, free of charge. Crazy. Now, 26 years later, we do have all the knowledge and books and art at our fingertips. We all carry in our pockets devices more powerful than computers that put a man on the moon. Access to scientific papers is a matter of seconds. The problem is, most of us just don't bother. No, the information superhighway did not bring us wisdom. On the contrary, people increasingly believe in chemtrails and reptilians and Earth being flat and COVID-19 conspiracies. A research by Stanford History Education Group showed that 80% of pupils in middle school did not succeed in the task of telling sponsored content apart from real news stories. And moreover, these technologies are increasingly being used not to foster democracy, but to intimidate those who are trying to expose injustice. Medical professionals, researchers, and journalists are being under attack. Everybody in Slovakia remembers what happened on the 21st of February 2018. A young man and his fiancée had to die because somebody wanted to silence investigative journalism. Critical thinking is facing difficult times. That is why we need people like our guest. People who are not afraid to dive into topics those in power may find sensitive. His work on the surveillance of the Muslim community, Russia's impact on the US elections, and the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic showed us the power of independent journalism and critical thinking. If someone wins a Pulitzer Prize, this is usually an indication that the person must have done some outstanding work. If somebody wins this prize 3 times, it means the person must have some really interesting stories to tell. So I would like to really welcome Mr. Matt Apuzzo to Communist University. Thank you.
I would like to thank Mr. Radomír Masaryk, the Deputy Rector for External Relations, for his kind welcome and for stressing the important role of journalists. Matt Apuzzo knows very well that not only autocrats monitor and watch journalists. Sometimes even democratic governments peek into our mails or tap into our phone calls. He takes the watchdog role very seriously when it comes to reporting on how governments navigate a very fine line between the individual privacy and national interest. Matt knows from his own experience how governmental pressures on journalists and their sources work. And he's always ready to talk about these issues because he understands that if a government monitors journalists without a legal reason, that government would do it without hesitation to any of its unsuspecting citizens. Even after a very short conversation with Matt, I understood that he doesn't need explanation who is who in this region. When I started telling him about the struggle to clean up the prosecution and the police from the mess that the governments of Robert Fico left behind, and when I was telling them about how Viktor Orbán is trying to stretch his influence in the region, he instantly understood the nature of struggles and challenges we face here. We also spoke about the commando that Marian Kočner, the suspected mastermind of the murder of Ján Kuciak, set up to monitor journalists. And we spoke about other issues that really concern journalists, and Matt assured me that those all are shared issues. Matt Apuzzo is one of those journalists who would never take lightly such a brutal intervention into the lives of journalists as it happened in Slovakia by monitoring journalists and taking pictures of their relatives. And this is why I am absolutely confident that his talk will strongly resonate with us, because it goes right into the heart of subject that concern us. And it actually explains why we need to be quite nervous about revelations such as the Pegasus scandal. Mr. Vice Rector already hinted at the Pulitzer Prizes of Matt Apuzzo, and he's a 3-time winner of Pulitzer Prizes. He got the first one in 2012 for his work on a theme that revealed the New York police surveillance. He was also part of the winning team covering the Trump administration in 2018. And in 2021, he was awarded for his work on covering the COVID pandemic. Please welcome Matt Apuzzo.
Thank you. I think I'm sufficiently socially distanced here, so I'm going to take this off. Thank you, Beata and Jan and everyone from The Spectator, and to everyone at the university, the Petit Academy Foundation, the Tetrabanka Foundation, and really everybody who helped put this together and has really welcomed me here to your lovely city. It's a real honor to be here, frankly. Amazing to be part of a program that whose past attendees have included such luminaries as James Steele, as well as colleagues and friends like Walt Bogdanich and Martha Mendoza. It's humbling just to be in their company. First off, I'm a reporter, not an academic. So that means I'm a storyteller, not a lecturer. So I hope you'll indulge me as I as I tell you a few stories. So I was sitting at my desk in the spring of 2013 at the Associated Press in Washington, D.C. And I sat in the back of the newsroom, and my colleague, Adam Goldman, and I, we were in these cubicles, and we worked together, and we would talk to each other constantly through the cubicles. And it was very annoying to everybody around us. It was very annoying to both of us, because half the time one of us would be on the phone and the other one wouldn't know it. And so you just hear like, "Hey, what's up?" And I go, "Yeah, what's going on?" And they're like, No, I'm on the phone. And then the person on the phone would get confused, but we're just having this conversation all day long. So I didn't make a lot of it when Adam said through the cubicle, "Hey, did you get this?" I get what? That email. Did you get this email? Open up my email, and I go to my inbox, and I see that there's an email from a government address. He goes, "Is this like spam or phishing or something?" I look at it, and no, this looks real. Open it up, and I said, "Well, it's not spam. This is the government informing us that they've seized our phone records." It was the United States Justice Department, and they had given us a copy of a subpoena from months earlier, and it was very broad. The FBI had access to lists of everyone we had talked to for months. Every incoming phone call, every outgoing phone call. And not just us, but our colleagues as well, our editors, I mean, they took the incoming and outgoing calls from the general phone number if you just happened to call the AP's office in Washington. They even took the incoming call logs from our fax machine. Who faxes? Nobody faxes. It's what's known as a blanket subpoena. It's the kind of things that prosecutors do when they're trying to unravel a drug gang or investigate the mafia or break up criminal conspiracies. But of course, this incredible power was being pointed at the newsroom of America's oldest news organization. It was being pointed at us. So I'd like to hit pause on that story for just a moment. We'll come back to me and Adam in just a minute. And I'd like to go back in time to St. Louis, Missouri. Test all of your American geography, sort of in the middle of the country. 1836 is the year. For those of you who don't know your American history, year by year, this was an incredibly difficult time. There were sizzling tensions between North and South. We were on the brink of our Civil War, and it was a fight over slavery and the very nature of the United States, what it was meant to be and what it would become. Missouri was a slave state at the time. Slavery was legal. And one day that April, a free black man named Francis McIntosh had come through town while working on a steamship and was arrested on trumped-up charges. In an effort to escape, he stabbed and killed a police officer. A white mob soon broke into the jail and dragged him out of town. They chained him to a tree and they burned him alive. A local judge convened what's known in the United States as a grand jury. It's a group of people who get together, hear evidence, and decide whether to bring charges. More specifically, it was a group of white men brought together to hear evidence and decide whether to bring charges. Now, there was no question that laws had been broken. Clearly, tying a prisoner to a tree and burning him alive represented what the judge himself called an outrageous violation of the law and Constitution. But the thing is, the judge said, there were so many people involved in this mob. And it was like such a spontaneous event. How can you blame any one of them? They were moved by the passions of the moment. And besides, the judge said, it's important to keep in mind what's really important. And that's when the judge handed the jurors a newspaper. It was the St. Louis Observer, which was a newspaper run by a man named Elijah Parrish Lovejoy. Lovejoy was an abolitionist, and he wrote openly and passionately about the sins of slavery. And as far as the judge was concerned, it was people like Elijah Parrish Lovejoy who were to blame for all the racial tensions going around, all the racial tensions that led to McIntosh's death. And the judge urged the jury to think about that. You make your own decision, but maybe you want to send a message to these abolitionists who are causing such problems. Send a message to the real enemy, to journalists like Lovejoy. I'm sure it won't surprise you to learn that the jury brought no charges against that mob. The death of Francis McIntosh went unpunished, which would be an injustice in and of itself. But it wasn't long until another mob, pro-slavery mob, turned against Lovejoy himself. He moved his printing press, but the mob followed. And when he sought protection from the government, they offered no help. In fact, the town voted a resolution against journalists who dared to write against slavery. Ultimately, it was even the town's mayor who delivered Lovejoy an ultimatum: give up your newspaper or burn with it. Police officers stood idly by as an angry mob set fire to the printing press and made good on the mayor's threat. As the fire started, Lovejoy stopped to try to extinguish it. He was shot and killed. Now, nothing that my colleagues or I have done was anywhere near as consequential for journalism or humanity as standing up against the greatest injustice in American history. Elijah Lovejoy was the first American martyr to a free press. Our experience with incursions on the First Amendment can't compare with the threats of a deadly mob. But the events of recent years have really changed the way I think about this moment in my life in 2013. And they offer a warning about the road ahead, both for journalists and for democracy itself. So let's go back to that subpoena, and let's talk about what we were doing at the time. So Adam and I and our colleagues, we were covering American intelligence agencies. We were writing about terrorism, drones, secret prisons, the legacy of 9/11. And in doing so, we were talking to people who were not allowed to talk to us. In journalism, we call them anonymous sources. But in short, they're people who we promised not to name in exchange for getting real information. Now, there's no question that reporters use anonymous sources too often. Readers, customers, smart news consumers are suspicious of anonymous sources, and they should be. Leaning on anonymous sources is the crutch of a lazy reporter, and worse, reporters who rely too heavily on anonymous sources only give cover to people in government who want to avoid accountability. But covering national security is one of those areas where we really need to rely on people to tell us what's going on, because the government stamps everything as classified, all of its biggest secrets. And anyone who talks about those secrets is putting themselves in legal jeopardy. Think about what we know about America's response to 9/11. Waterboarding, drones, secret prisons, black sites, torture, the abuses at Abu Ghraib, what really went on at Guantanamo Bay, warrantless wiretapping. All of this was classified. If we relied on the government's official version of events, what would we even know? Students in the room, if a professor assigned you to write a paper on America's response to 9/11, but you could only use what the government officially told us at the time, what would you even write about? And would it even be true? So that's what Adam and I were doing in 2013. We were going around talking to people and trying to understand what was really going on in the world behind the smoke screen that governments were putting up. But here's the thing, be honest. Journalism is an imperfect endeavor. It's messy. Giving reporters the right to question the government and the right and power to reveal government secrets is a risky, complicated process. We don't always find the right balance. And the marker of what's right and wrong and when we should publish and when we shouldn't, that marker gets moved all the time. During World War II, Franklin Roosevelt, he used to be able to ask reporters to withhold sensitive information whenever he wanted. And more often than not, they listened. Things are different today. But governments still ask, and it's not always easy to know when you're making the right call. One example. When I was at the AP, Adam and I learned that Richard Levinson, an American man who had disappeared in Iran, he had been on this harebrained operation for the CIA. But the government had lied about it for years. They said he had been traveling there on business. He was just a private citizen. This had nothing to do with intelligence services. He was just a private individual. It was a lie. This was obviously big news. But as we prepared our story, people in the government made a compelling case that identifying him as a spy would only hinder efforts to find him. It might even get him killed. Suddenly, we weren't sort of talking about abstract threats. We were talking about one man's life. We held that story for 3 years. 3 years before ultimately writing it. There are probably journalists in this room pulling their hair out, fidgeting in their seats at the idea of sitting on a story like that for 3 years. Now, the same year that we broke that story, colleagues at the Times wrote about the death of an American al-Qaeda operative named Anwar al-Awlaki. The CIA asked the Times not to reveal that the drone that had killed him had taken off from an airbase in Saudi Arabia. Now, why was that such an important secret, the location of an airbase? Well, if you say it's Saudi Arabia is going to be really upset, and it could cause a diplomatic fight. We might even lose the ability to launch drones from that base. It could jeopardize the whole future of the drone program. So Dean Baquet, the executive editor at the time, agreed to withhold that single fact. But of course, somebody else wrote it. And Dean has said, looking back, it was a bad request for secrecy. He would say that government requests to withhold information became too frequent, and that the bar for asking reporters to withhold information from the public became too low. A year or so later, Mark Mazzetti and I at the Times did a very deep investigation into the drone program, and we actually identified the names. We named the CIA officers who were in charge of the drone program. And the CIA went crazy. They said it was unnecessary, risky, and irresponsible. But Dean, our editor, had our backs. He said, quote, "I think the CIA got used to everybody saying yes right after 9/11. And I don't think they've quite accepted that the terrain has changed." And boy, the terrain has changed a lot. In the run-up to our subpoena, the Obama administration, again back to 2013, was engaged in an unprecedented campaign to punish people for talking to reporters. Obama was using the Espionage Act, to go after people who weren't spies, but who simply talked to reporters. Of course, that often meant trampling on the reporters themselves. Now, the highest profile case, of course, was my colleague and friend, James Risen. The government subpoenaed him, demanded that he testify and identify the people who talked to him about a botched operation against the Iranian nuclear program. They threatened to put Jim in jail unless he broke a promise he made and went back on everything he believed as a journalist. Of course, Jim refused, but he lived several years with that threat hanging over over his head. With all that going on, that's when Adam and I revealed that the CIA had foiled a very serious al-Qaeda bomb plot. And it involved a sophisticated new technology that was aimed at defeating airport metal detectors. The government hadn't disclosed any of this. And when we told them we were going to write it, they said, "Could you just hold off for a little bit? Because it's a pretty big deal, and the president wants to be the one to make the announcement." We don't hold stories for political reasons. We made the decision to publish, and I can't help but wonder whether our phone records only got seized because we preempted the president's speech. This tension between the government and the reporters, as I said, it's messy, but it's also important. It's by design. Who made reporters the experts in what secrets to reveal? We don't have all the facts. We don't know everything. We can't see the future. We certainly don't know the consequences of our reporting, and we don't know everything that the intelligence agencies do. It's scary, that lack of information. It's humbling. the power that a reporter has to reveal things with such high stakes. But the alternative is that we leave it to the government to be the gatekeeper. And I go back to my 9/11 example. What would we know if we just left it to the government? The American lawyer Jack Goldsmith writes about this in his book, Power and Constraint. Jack used to work for the Justice Department, but he's not one to gloss over the role of journalists. He writes in his book about the important accountability role played by what he calls clever reporters and disgruntled leakers. I maybe wouldn't use those terms to describe it, but from a former Justice Department lawyer, I guess I'll take it. He says, when the government acts out of public sight, it is more prone than usual to make mistakes and excesses, and it sometimes tries to keep those mistakes and excesses secret to avoid embarrassment. This is a big problem for democracy, because citizens cannot hold officials accountable for these actions if they don't know about them. All of this is a long way of saying that in 2013, when the Justice Department came and seized our phone record, I believe that we were part of some long and storied tension between government and reporters. Sometimes we hold too much. Sometimes the government asks for too much. Sometimes we write something and the government gets mad. Sometimes the government goes too far and the press gets outraged. We all recalibrate. We're all better for it. That's how I saw things. Goldsmith would say that's a healthy tension, that it's never going to be a perfect balance. The Obama administration realized it had moved too far and it was hurting a free press, so they rewrote the rules about when prosecutors could go after journalists. Jack would say that's how it's supposed to work. Democracy. It's a persuasive argument. And as much as I hated it back when they took my phone records in 2013, and as much as I spoke out against it, I think deep down, I probably agreed with Jack. This is the process. It's messy, but it works itself out. Democracy is better for it. But I didn't realize that something important was happening. The ground was moving, as Dean said, the terrain was shifting under our feet. I can't say exactly when it began, but I'm pretty sure for me, the first sign should have been in the mid-2000s when Jim Risen and Eric Lischblau revealed in the Times that the American government was spying on American citizens without warrants. Obviously, there was pushback to that story. People were upset. But the objection from many wasn't just that the reporters shouldn't have written the story. It was that they were criminal for writing it, for revealing these secrets. And when they won the Pulitzer Prize, journalists' highest award, their critics dubbed it the Pulitzer Prize for treason. Some people said they ought to be thrown in jail. It was offensive, of course, but I think at the time I dismissed it as absurd. And I admit now that I didn't fully appreciate the danger baked into that rhetoric. I didn't see that once you're throwing around words like treason and criminal, once the government turns the machinery of its criminal justice system on a journalist, it's a dangerous mix. I didn't recognize that these were the same seeds that politicians were planting during Elijah Parrish Lovejoy's time, when prosecutors deflected conversations about slavery and said it was the reporters who were causing the real problems. I didn't see the dangerous road that we were on. It was February 2017 when Donald Trump tried out a new line that became a favorite talking point. The fake news media is not my enemy, he said. It is the enemy of the American people. These twin terms, fake news on one hand, enemy of the people on the other, became a reliable applause line for President Trump. It's a bit of what we call in America, a bit of red meat you throw to the base. I admit I don't remember where I was or how I received those words at the time. I was at the New York Times, still covering national security, still trying to tell people what was going on with their government. Probably I read those words on Twitter, of course, and just rolled my eyes. Reporters get pretty good at taking criticism. And we learn pretty quickly to recognize when politicians are just blaming us to deflect attention from something else. Comes with the territory. But it didn't take long for authoritarian governments to embrace that fake news label. Assad uses it to wave away questions whenever a reporter asks about human rights in Syria. Fake news. It's the response you can expect from Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela as he dismisses a journalist who reports on or asks questions about the erosion of democracy. Fake news. Of course, the Kremlin jumped on board on this real quick. Fake news. In Myanmar, where the government denies the existence of its systematic campaign against the Rohingya Muslims, they say, quote, "There is no such thing as Rohingya. It's all fake news." And in Beijing, the Communist Party's People Daily wrote, "If the President of the United States claims that his own nation's leading media outlets are a stain on America, then negative news about China and other countries should be taken with a grain of salt." China, of course, soon expelled the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post from its borders. Here in Europe, Viktor Orban has turned the legitimate press into some kind of boogeyman, spinning a tale in which journalists are part of some global conspiracy against him. Now, there's no question that undermining confidence in the press is dangerous. And you can see how quickly strong men glommed on to the phrase as a way to just sort of bat away any effort at accountability journalism. But it's this second phrase, enemy of the people, that is particularly dangerous. Trump didn't invent it, of course, and the Nazis probably didn't invent it either, but Hitler's propaganda minister sure adopted it. Back then it was, quote, "If someone wears the Jewish star, he is an enemy of the people." And in the Soviet Union, when Stalin's government declared you an enemy of the people, it amounted to a death sentence. These words have meanings. These words have consequences. The publisher of the New York Times, my boss, A.G. Sulzberger, met privately with President Trump and made this very argument. He told the president that his language was not just divisive, but increasingly dangerous. And AG made the point, it's okay to be mad at the press. It's okay to not like your press coverage. It's okay to criticize journalists. And it's okay to tell the world you don't like what reporters are writing about you. That give and take, we talked about it earlier. That's how it's supposed to work. It's not okay for a president. It's not only okay for a president to criticize reporters. It's part of the system, part of democracy. But AG made the argument that labeling journalists as the enemy of the people, the enemy of democracy, is a bridge too far. The president, of course, didn't stop using that term and only doubled down on it. At a rally, the president singled out a congressman, a United States congressman, who had actually body slammed a reporter, grabbed him by the neck, threw him down onto the ground for daring to ask a question about healthcare. And the president said, "Hey, any guy that can do a body slam, he's my kind of guy." Shouldn't have come as any surprise then that things started to feel a little more dangerous for reporters. My colleague, Hannah Beach, who covers Southeast Asia, was at a speech by the Prime Minister in Cambodia. And in his press conference, he called out the New York Times by name as fake news and threatened that if our story didn't toe the government's line, there would be consequences. "The Cambodian people will remember your faces," he said. What do consequences look like? In Canada, a CBC photographer gets punched in the face at a Trump rally in Canada. A local reporter in Washington State, says that she was accosted at a protest by an armed man who told her that the news media was not welcome. He said that within the next year, he would kill her and other journalists. Now, not every threat or every case of violence can be traced back to the Trump administration. Absolutely not. Of course not. But we can see what happens when governments start to regard journalists as the enemy. Here in Europe, of course, we have the case of Daphne Galizia, Maltese journalist who was covering organized crime and public corruption. She wrote these words: "There are crooks everywhere you look now. The situation is desperate." That was her last post on a Monday afternoon, just a half hour before she left her family home to run errands, a half hour before she was blown to pieces by a car bomb. Now, I won't pretend to be steeped in the details of that case, but here's what I know. I know that an investigation has concluded that the Maltese government had carried out a persistent campaign to discredit her and attack her reporting. The investigation found, quote, "Whoever planned and carried out the assassination did so in the knowledge that they would be protected by those who have an interest in silencing a journalist." Why? Because the government had made clear that it found Daphne's reporting to be an intrusive and unwelcome nuisance. And how did the government react to the death? Well, the Prime Minister's chief of staff pushed some bogus tip on reporters, telling them it was a mafia hit. It was an execution as part of just like a fuel smuggling racket. That, of course, turned out to be false, an intentional misdirection. 2 of the 3 people charged in that case have asked for a pardon deal in exchange for information about a former government minister who they say was a key figure in her killing. My newspaper's editorial page summed up the situation this way: if reporters can be killed, if reporters can be killed there with impunity, they can be killed anywhere. This is the risk of the road we're on. It's a toxic stew when violent rhetoric combines with the official power of a government to go after a journalist. Sadly, everyone in the room here today doesn't need to look to my home country or to Malta or to some dictatorship for an example of where this leads. As everyone knows, Jan Kuciak and his fiancée, Martina Kusnerova, were murdered in their home in 2018. Jan had been tirelessly investigating organized crime and government corruption. That would be bad enough. But in response to those murders, 2 brave reporters briefly faced charges themselves for the crime of daring to report on the investigation into a murdered journalist. One of them, Monica Todava, was not only put under surveillance, she also faced government social services checks on whether she was a good parent. The former prime minister called her a crook in a skirt and suggested, without evidence, that she was somehow corrupt. This is scary stuff. Scary stuff. It's hard enough to be out there doing your job, worrying about the mafia or an angry mob. It's something quite different when the machinery of a government, democracy, is turned against a journalist. It's hard to walk back from that. So that's the backdrop for what happened to us in June, when my colleagues at the Times and I got another notification from the Justice Department. This time, it was the Trump administration that had secretly seized our phone records. Prosecutors had also sought records from Google related to our emails, including IP addresses that could be used to identify our phone's geolocation. Now, I'm not a forensics investigator But I know that if the government can find out who you're talking to and where you've been, then it's game over in terms of protecting a source. So what were they after? What was it all about? They were trying to understand how we reported a story about the FBI and its investigations into Hillary Clinton and the Trump campaign during the 2016 presidential election. And it wasn't just me. It wasn't even just the New York Times. Journalists at CNN, Washington Post, they got subpoenaed too, all for different stories, different articles, all informing the public about things that the president, his friends, and his administration disliked. This felt different. It just felt different from the last time. It felt like the Justice Department, the very people tasked with upholding the law, it felt like they had taken all this enemy of the people garbage and weaponized it. Prosecutors turned the machinery of the criminal justice system against us. They treated the newsrooms of America's major news organizations like criminal enterprises. After all, if you're dealing with the enemy of the people, why not ask the cops to step in and start rummaging around through our records, trying to figure out what we're up to, who we're talking about? It's the enemy of the people, after all. What should we make of the fact that the Washington Post, the New York Times, and CNN also happen to be the news organizations that have received the bulk of Trump's enemy of the people criticism? And they just happen to be the ones targeted by federal law enforcement. I live in Brussels now, very different city. I've lived there for over 3 years. I do investigative reporting for one of the few news organizations that remains financially committed to trying to cover the world. And warts and all. That sounds like it should be a given, but these days, let's be honest, that's a luxury. So I was in Brussels, watching on television, like so many others, on January 6, 2021, when an angry mob stormed the United States Capitol. That's my neighborhood. That's my house. The place I still call home is just up the street. I watched people erect a gallows on the lawn of the Capitol. That's the lawn where my kids used to go sledding when it snowed. Some of my friends and many of my colleagues were in the crowd trying to cover the mob. Others were inside the Capitol doing their job when the mob broke in. I saw on television that somebody had scrawled the words, "Murder the media," inside the building. The mob moved on reporters, intimidating journalists. A team from the Associated Press had its cameras and equipment smashed. It was surreal to watch. Violence against democracy, vile toward reporters, all while people chanted USA, USA, USA. Nevertheless, I'm trying to be optimistic. I don't want this to be a downer. I'm not trying to be a bummer here. There are hopeful signs. There really are. Recently, two journalists, Maria Ressa of the Philippines and Dmitry Muratov of Russia, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for, quote, their courageous fight for freedom of expression, which is a precondition for democracy and lasting peace. Mr. Muratov, the editor of an independent newspaper there, actually ignored several calls from Norway, people trying to tell him that he had won. He was too busy arguing with his reporters. Editors, man, good to know they're all the same. Of course, within hours of that announcement, The Kremlin labeled 9 journalists and activists as foreign agents. So maybe it's not all good news. There's still work to be done. But the Nobel Prize citation reads like a calling. Free, independent, and fact-based journalism serves to protect against abuse of power, lies, and war propaganda. At home, back in Washington, the Biden administration has said it will never again subpoena journalists. The kind of blanket prohibition that we've never seen before. It's a good policy, but it's only as good as long as the government in power decides it should be. If a new president, like Trump or Obama, comes in and decides that controlling information is worth trampling all over reporters, well, we're back to where we started. That policy goes out the window. As for the January 6th riot, an investigation continues. There are obviously many worrisome things about that day. The attack against fair elections, the beating of a police officer, the heavy dose of lies and misinformation that preceded the attacks, and the efforts by some to reimagine the events of that day and to tell people not to believe their own eyes. All of that is true, of course, but I also see some troubling parallels to a pair of angry mobs in the 1800s, the ones in Missouri that seem in hindsight to be so obviously connected. First, you had the gruesome death of Francis McIntosh. Then you had a judge declare it was a spontaneous uprising and nobody could be blamed. And I think about what happened next when that judge handed the jury a copy of a newspaper and said, you know what? Maybe it's a journalist who's really to blame. I think about that and I worry because the machinery of government, the machinery of law enforcement was used to undermine a journalist. Then it was the town government and their ordinance against reporters. And then it was the mayor negotiating a reporter's terms of surrender. And finally, it was a burning printing plant, a fired shot, and a fallen journalist. Thank you.
Matt, thank you so much for this fine anatomy of governmental pressures. And I'm sure that my country can contribute to the labels such as Soros, mercenaries, prostitutes, and enemies of the nation. And after the murder of Ján Kuciak, we thought that actually some politicians and government officials will be far more careful with these labels, but we were wrong. But now let's open the floor to questions so that we can involve our dear guests into the conversation. You can ask here by raising your hands and you will get the microphone. Also, people can ask questions online by using the password through Slido, hashtag Apuzzo. You can write your questions in Slovak or in English, so please feel free to ask the questions. And we already have one but I will basically start with my question because I was wondering when listening to your speech that if you changed anything on your working methods or your functioning after you learned that the government was actually searching your phone conversations, if you had to modify something on how you worked with your sources or in the newsroom.
Sure. I mean, I suppose the good thing about 2021 and modern technology is we all have access now to apps like Signal and WhatsApp if it's configured correctly. And, you know, we all know that we can be tracked by our phone. So there's an awareness there, and there are opportunities to easily communicate in secured ways. You can meet in person. There are a number of tactics you can adopt. But the thing that's so upsetting to me is we're not spies. We're not doing anything wrong. We shouldn't have to behave like spies. We shouldn't have to use the technology of spies. We shouldn't have to meet in secret and, leave our phones behind and communicate over encrypted channels and, all of this other garbage that we have to do. They're making us act like spies. And I can't help but feel as if they want us to do that, because then it makes what we're doing look somehow sinister. And, I just feel like that's one of the many casualties of these subpoenas and these intrusions by governments.
Is there any question in the room? If not,
We have one in the back.
Oh, there is. Okay.
Matt, what makes you so optimistic about Joe Biden's administration, because he was serving as vice president under Obama?
But don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I'm optimistic about his administration. I'm optimistic about the fact that they have a policy in place now that says that they will not subpoena journalists. I think that is a good policy. My newspaper, my publisher, has made it clear that that's a good important step. But until it gets codified into law, it remains only a policy. And I think, whoever's president, my paper has argued that there needs to be some real legal protection for journalists, protecting them from subpoenas for work products like notes, protecting them from subpoenas to testify, identify sources, and then protections of not having their phone records seized. So don't get me wrong, I don't care who's in office. I just want there to be some protections built into the system. I'm an equal opportunity agitator.
We actually have a question which was voted by 5 on Slido. You mentioned politicians turning against the free press in the US and Hungary. You are based in Benelux. Do you have similar concerns about Western Europe?
Of course, I have concerns about Western Europe. I have concerns about the United States. I don't think this is a problem that is unique to any one part of the world. Most of my talk was frankly focused on the US. I don't spend a lot of time I live in Brussels, but I don't cover the EU and the machinery of the EU. I don't spend a lot of time interacting with them. I will say that there was a situation where we were reporting on the watering down of a report about Chinese misinformation, and one of the spokesmen for the European Commission disparaged another media outlet to another reporter by calling it misinformation. And I thought that was dangerous. I think, when you have people from the European Union referring to credible, accurate, fair, impartial, and independent news organizations as misinformation, I feel like you've taken a step down that slippery slope. I think the spokesman ultimately apologized. But yeah, this is not a problem that is limited to one region or the other.
Questions from the room? Yes.
Thank you. I want to somehow connect to the previous question. What do you think, or do you have an idea what it takes and how long it could take to recover from, let's say, Trump administration or the government that calls media outlets or journalists prostitutes and media outlets? What are the necessary steps and how long could it take?
So you want an answer from a historian. I am just a journalist, but I will say, Jim Risen, who I wrote about, who I mentioned in my speech, he wrote a piece for the New York Times not long after Trump got elected, and the headline said something like, "When Trump goes after journalists, you can thank Obama." And I think a lot of Democrats got very upset by that. But the truth is it's an erosion, right? Like, you imagine a rock being eroded slowly by a running river. It doesn't happen all at once. And so, we can talk about Trump, you talk about Obama, you can go back to the Bush administration. These things build on each other and they build on themselves, and that's the risk. It's not like we can say, oh, well, the Trump administration subpoenaed a bunch of journalists. What do we have to do to sort of bounce back from that? Well, we have to build from before that, because this is becoming a bipartisan affair. This is becoming a tactic used by, in my country, Democrats and Republicans alike. I think you're seeing it in democracies around the world, and I think this is part of the process. These conversations like this are, I think, part of the process of people saying, this is important. We don't want to lose this.
There is another very difficult question on Slido, but it's the top, so I have to ask. Matt, why so many people in Eastern Europe believe in misinformation? How about in the
I was just going to say, why Eastern Europe? I mean, why do so many people believe in in misinformation? I think one of the reasons is gathering news is hard. Gathering news is expensive. Sending people in to find out what really happened, collect the facts, confirm the facts, sit down, write the story or film the TV piece, or record the podcast, have it edited, have it fact-checked, put it online, have somebody host it, the website, put it in a newspaper, have somebody print the newspaper. It takes a lot of people, it takes time, and it's expensive. And having somebody write a piece of garbage and put it online and post it to Facebook or post it to some nonsense website is cheap, fast, and easy. So to me, it's just sort of simple amplification of noise. How do we amplify the credible sources and turn down the noise a little bit on the garbage? I think that's one of the real tests for media in the 21st century.
Is there any question from the room? Or everybody's writing on Slido? Okay.
This is cool. I never had, when I was in school, we
Yeah,
never
people
had
can
this.
vote actually which question they want.
Pretty
me
soon
to
nobody will
ask.
even come. They'll just sit at home, watch it on the live stream, and just tweet the thing.
Yes, but
We'll
given,
never have to see each other.
given your pandemic reporting, do you think we will ever discover how COVID-19 emerged? Or has China decided to shut down any real possibility of?
Yeah, that's a great question. My colleagues and I have tried to get underneath this. And, the question of how COVID emerged is not, for me and for, I think, scientists, is not a question of like, let's figure out who to blame, right? I think the question is, if we can identify the origins of this virus, it can help protect us against future pandemics and help us in developing treatments and helping us get a sense of how this virus mutates, how it evolves. So it's a very important question. I think, look, I believe in science, right? So I believe that ultimately scientists will have an idea of how it happened. If it requires sort of getting into China and really investigating the actions of the Chinese government and Chinese institutions, I don't think that is likely to happen in the short term. But I think scientists are pretty clever, and I think we will get some idea of how it happened. I'm aware of all of the sort of different theories. I don't sort of attach myself to one. I'd like to see more investigation. I think it's crucially important.
Okay, let's see some alive person asking a question. Yes, please.
Thank you. If I have correctly understood your speech, The speech was essentially about the relation between journalists and governments or government bodies, and how important it is to defend truth. On the other hand, on internet, you can find articles speaking about the so-called deep state, I mean the United States. And under these articles, a real power is not in hands of president or in hands of government, but in hands of deep state. In connection with this, I would like to ask you, what is your opinion? Is the deep state a reality, or does it exist only in conspiracy theories? Thanks.
Well, I think the words deep state it's just a branding. We're talking about branding and marketing, right? If you go every day to work in a government building to print driver's licenses or to collect tax forms, are you a public servant or are you a bureaucrat, right? Like, we could say when we're angry at the motor vehicles department or the tax department, we say the damn bureaucrats, they sit on their butt and they don't do anything. And, you know, when people go to work and they work hard and it's your uncle who worked for the post office for 50 years, you say he was a lifelong public servant. Well, if you are angry at people in the government and you think that they are talking to reporters when they shouldn't be, you might call them the enemy of you might call reporters the enemy of the people, and you call the people they talk to the deep state. Yes, we talk as reporters to people who work in government and who have worked in government for a long time. You could say we talk to bureaucrats. You could say we talk to public servants. You could say we talk to the deep state. You can say we talk to career experts. The word you choose to describe them just explains what the political motivation of how you're trying to cast them. The deep state is just people who work for government. Bureaucrats are just people who work for government. Public servants are just people who work for the government.
We have a lot of questions about misinformation. And one is how the government, or if the government should tackle hoax and disinformation so that it does not collide with the freedom of speech. And also a question about social media, which helps the spread of misinformation, if this can be changed.
Well, I obviously am concerned about any time the government wants to get involved in saying what qualifies as real news and fake news, right? This is a hoax, this is not. I think if you give government that power, it's not going to be used for good. I tell you that. I think with companies like Facebook, the question is, do they amplify misinformation? Of course they do. You know, social media, this idea of it's the spread of you know, conspiratorial thinking. We have to figure out how to fix that. That's, you know, in computer jargon, we say that's not a bug, that's a feature, right? Like, Facebook was built to take small groups of people built around a common way of thinking or a common interest and amplify what they're talking about so that people can join in and people can shape their own experience. That's true whether we're talking about Champions League football, whether we're talking about stamp collecting, whether we're talking about astrology, or whether we're talking about conspiracy theories about 9/11 or a stolen election. These communities exist online, they share information, the algorithms amplify that, and I think one of the challenges facing journalists and facing the public in the 21st century is, how do we sort through that? I'm optimistic, frankly, by the generation of students that I've met here the past 2 days, I spoke at my alma mater, Colby College, a small school in Maine, up near Canada. I think the generation coming up is just more savvy about this stuff. They grew up on the internet. They're much more sophisticated. I think naturally it's saying, wait a minute, where's this coming from? I think they've grown up with the idea that people can make stuff up about them, about their friends, and create and spread lies. And I think it is good for democracy that sooner or later this generation is gonna be the majority, and they're gonna be more sophisticated about how they consume the internet.
Question from the room? Yes, please.
Dobrý večer. Ja nemám veľa skúseností s americkou situáciou, ale za 30 rokov demokracie na Slovensku z objektívneho hľadiska by som povedal, že aj na strane vládnej mašinérie sa objavovalo veľa pochybných novinárov. A ešte väčšia tragédia je, že by sme si mali uvedomiť, že na Slovensku veľa tých čelných predstaviteľov bolo absolventmi práve tejto univerzity, ktorých teraz negatívne vnímame. Ako zaujať sa k tomuto problému?
Mohli by ste v krátkosti zopakovať otázku, že na čo sa pýtate?
Pýtam sa na to, že poviem konkrétny príklad. Kočner novinár, Kuciak novinár. Alebo tí predstaviteľi vlády, ktorých máme zlé skúsenosti, sú absolventmi tejto univerzity. Toto je, myslím, ten podstatný problém. A nie len to kategorizovať, že na jednej strane negatívna vláda a na druhej strane pozitívni novinári.
So I think the gentleman...
No, I got it.
Oh, you
Ďakujem.
I got it. Thank you. Sorry, it just took me a second. I don't know enough about the specifics to really get into the weeds on this case, but I have no problem saying that if you kill a journalist, you're a bad guy. Like, I got no problem with that. Like, if you murder people, you're a bad guy. Like, that I'm okay with. So I won't get into a debate on the merits of sort of goodness and badness on the sliding scale. If you kill people, you're a bad guy.
We will take a question from Slido. These days, misinformation is free, while verified reporting is behind the paywall. This points to a problem with the business model of media. Do you see any better way?
Well, the business model of media has always been something of a trade-off, right? You could say 20 years ago, well, the business model of media is to sell advertising to big companies. Is that right? You could say the business model of places like the Washington Post, it's being financed by one of the richest men in the world. Is that right? I mean, I think that one of the challenges as we face is collecting the news costs money. It just does. And so how do you pay for that? There are nonprofits that have come up to try to help make this model work, especially at small scales, regional newspapers, independent radio stations. I mean, there's no easy answer here, but asking people to pay a little bit of money to receive one of the most important commodities in a democracy doesn't seem like that's a bad model. Now, huge issue is how do we reach people who can't afford to pay or don't have the access to the internet or the journalism, and what we're reporting would be crucially important to them. That is a real question. But I'm not sure that the idea of asking people to pay a little bit for journalism is a bad model.
One of the things we've done at the Times is on important issues like the coronavirus, we just take the paywall down. Take the paywall down. When there was flooding in New York City, take the paywall down. Forest fires, people need information on how to live, where to find help. Take the paywall down. Our goal is not to withhold information from people, but at the same time, it only works. It's like when I was in high school and college, nobody wanted to pay for music. Right? All music should be free, right? We all used this thing called Napster. We downloaded MP3s. You know, we were stealing music. I think, thankfully, there's a generation that came up after us that realized that, you know, if you want to watch good movies and good content, you pay a little bit. You want to listen to music, you pay a little bit. You want to have verifiable, fact-based reporting, you pay a little bit. Put your money where what you believe in. If you believe in journalism and you believe in, you know, information, subscribe to your local. You don't subscribe to the New York Times. I mean, you should, but you don't have to. Subscribe to your local paper. Support them, and I don't think that's a bad model. I think it's in the direction of where we need to be.
This is actually such an important point, especially in the region where oligarchs are really buying up newspapers and they try to use it for their own interest. Questions from the room? Is there any? Yes, please.
Hi, I would like to ask, what do you think that should be done so that especially young people would be more interested in real journalism and verified information? Thank you.
You know, I don't know the situation here, but I don't think the problem is we don't have enough people interested. I think the problem is we need to figure out how to make it a sustainable career where, you know, people can come out of college and, you know, come out of university and get a job and feed their family, you know, work their way up. You know, at small newspapers where the pay isn't very good, or small TV stations where the pay isn't very good. That to me is a bigger challenge than getting people interested. It's a fascinating career. It's a great job, whether you're covering the town council for your local paper, or you're covering the United Nations for the New York Times, or you're a foreign correspondent for CNN. They're amazing. It's an amazing career. It's an amazing life. You get to ask people questions for a living. If you're a curious person, if you like putting together puzzles, if you have a really good, what we call a really good bullshit detector, you know, this is a great career. I think there's a lot of reasons to be excited about it. I wish we could make it more sustainable at the smaller and mid levels, both in the United States and elsewhere.
The only journalists who are given support are the dead journalists. The person who asked is quoting Roberto Saviano. Do you think that that journalism is missing support, mainly financial support?
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably maybe answered that question, but I mean, there's a reason that oligarchs are buying newspapers, right? And so if we say, well, we don't want oligarchs and politicians to own newspapers, then what's the answer? If we say that we just think journalists should be like monks, or it's like we should sort of take a vow of poverty. Should the newsrooms be perpetually broke? Where is the news going to come from? There has to be a way that this works. And if we don't want politicians and their friends buying up newspapers, then we have to figure out a way to financially support them. And right now, what works is subscribe to the newspaper you don't want to go away. I think that's the only answer.
Question from the room? No question from the room. We have on Slido, how do you think to increase media, how could someone increase media literacy in Slovakia, or let's say like anywhere, how can the number of people who believe in hoaxes and misinformation be reduced? I think we spoke a little bit.
I think we
about-
spoke a little bit about that. I think media literacy is something that I'd like to see taught in schools a little bit. You know, I don't want to add more work for hardworking teachers, but how we consume information, I think, is something that would be really good in the way that, you know, I learned to, you know, check the card catalog of the library and the Dewey Decimal System, and now you learn how to do it online. I think there should be a way that we're teaching kids from a young age how to be skeptical about what they read online, of everything. And I mean, be skeptical of what you read in, you know, what the mainstream media. Be skeptical of that. That's fine, you know. But be an intelligent and, you know, active news consumer.
An anonymous person is interested in knowing, have ever you been offered the money to lie about something in public?
No, I mean, maybe that's a great sign that I've never been offered money. Maybe because they know that I would not only not take it, but I would probably write about it. But no, that wouldn't go well. You know, my soul's not for sale.
Questions from the public? Yes.
Good evening. I'm Nadia Barňáková. I have worked here in Slovakia for a few medias, and I would actually like to ask you about fact-checking organization and their role in general in maybe mediating between the conflicts of, for example, politicians stating fake news and newsrooms, as you were, and maybe also their role in that could be helpful in financing actually media.
Yeah, so I think fact-checking organizations in the United States, we have a thing called PolitiFact. And I know these, you know, news organizations around the world have taken on fact-checking. I think it's super important that, you know, we tell people in real time what's right, accurate, and truthful, and what's not. I think the risk is if you don't believe the media, then you probably don't believe the fact checkers, right? So I think that's a challenge, but I think it's crucially responsible. The news moves too fast. Like, I don't mean the news business moves too fast. It's the news. Things happen so quickly now that we can't afford to just let somebody say something that's patently false and then come back to it for tomorrow's paper. You know, live fact checking becomes kind of like the bread and butter of journalism these days. So I don't think there's a way to separate anymore fact checking from what we do in our day-to-day jobs.
How do you find out that your secret sources of information are reliable, trustworthy, and not just catfishing you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how do you find out that people are telling you the truth? Well, part of it is you be really polite to them and thank them for their information, but don't believe them. I mean, you don't believe them. You don't believe them until you tell somebody, you talk to somebody else, and you talk to somebody else, and then hopefully you find somebody who's got some documents. And, you know, that's the difference between somebody sent me an anonymous tip over the internet and I just run it versus somebody sends an anonymous tip over the internet and, you know, we take 3 reporters and, you know, in 3 weeks reporting it out before we get to it. And then we bring it to our editor and the editor says, yeah, but what if he's lying? Well, what if he's wrong about that? How do you know this? How do you know that? And that kind of questioning, that sort of Socratic method of editing is meant to catch people like that. And we still miss people. I mean, you know, stuff still gets through and we have to write corrections. But I think one of the things that makes newspapers and news organizations credible is when they attach corrections to their stories. And if it's a big mistake, they spend the time to report out their mistakes and say, this is how the mistake was made. That to me adds credibility. You know, I want to know that there's an accountability mechanism for the journalism I'm consuming, the same way I want to know there's accountability for the government I'm covering.
Question from the room? Yes, please.
You mentioned Facebook as a source for misinformation, but especially in the US, there's like actual media companies such as Fox who, if not downright spread misinformation, then they at least participate in spreading misinformation. Do you see a way out of that?
I mean, I don't, do I see, so the problem you're describing isn't with any network. It's, the problem we're describing is, at least in the United States, I don't know how it is here, but you can just choose your own bubble, right? Like if I don't want to hear from a conservative, I can just say, I'm not going to follow any conservatives on Twitter. I'm going to block everybody on Facebook. I'm only going to watch left-wing media. My truth is this. And if I'm a conservative and I don't want to hear from liberals, I can just do that. I can just click, 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 and I don't have to hear from anybody I disagree with. And that's so dangerous. Like, that's just so dangerous. The, I mean, I know people who just, I know so many people who just live in that bubble and don't want to have their beliefs challenged. And I don't know how we walk back from that. I really don't. I really don't know how we walk back from that. That is a thing that we have to make a conscious effort to do. I mean, we can all do it. We can all say, I want to hear from, you know, people I disagree with. I want them in my Twitter feed. I'm not on Twitter, but I want them in my Facebook feed. I'm not on Facebook either, but I want them in whatever you're consuming news. I want to subscribe to them. I want to hear them, even if just to understand the arguments of the people I disagree with. I want more of that. I want to hear from multiple people. I think that's the only way I can see right now to get there.
I think our next question is related to this topic. Do you think it's a good idea to shut down conspiracy portals?
I don't know. I mean, I don't like, I guess because I'm just such a cynic. I just say, like, if I say, yeah, we should shut down conspiracy portals, the first person they're going to come after is going to be like some crazy conspiracy portal, and then the second one is going to be a newspaper, right? Like, they're never going to use it for, it's never going to, when you start giving the government power to shut down information sites, I get, well, maybe it's because it says it's just a good idea, like a good idea for the world if there were no more conspiracy sites, probably sure. Do I think it's a good idea that there are some sort of policy out there to shut down information online? That makes me nervous, which is why this is such a hard question, right? If we could say, we'll wave a magic wand, we'll pass a law, we'll get rid of all of the bad information and only the good information will get through, and then we'll be fine. Great, but it's not going to work like that. It doesn't work that. It's messy. You know, the First Amendment protects people who, you know, believe that, you know, we were abducted by aliens, and we're all living the plot of the movie The Matrix. I mean, the First Amendment protects them too, and I don't like the idea of the government, you know, shutting anybody down. So that gives me pause.
We will take a last question from the audience, if there is any. Yes, please.
Dear Mr. Apuzzo, thank you very much for the speech today. And I would like to ask, what do you think about the college system in the US? Would you blame it for the spread of misinformation? Because it's sort of exclusive for the rich ones who then get further educated, but the majority of the people is then not really able to critically evaluate information. What do you think about that? Thank you very much.
I think it's a huge issue. I don't know that I would say I blame the system for misinformation, but you're absolutely right that, you know, access to a university education is a strong driver of, you know, being able to consume news more critically. But I don't think it's necessarily as simple as that. Now, look, I have 2 kids. The cost of American education is terrifying. I mean, the university I went to now costs $75,000 a year. That's insane. That's insane. So of course something has to be, I mean, this is not a sustainable system long term. I have no solution. I know nothing about the higher education system other than it's damn expensive for a mom and dad to try to pay for it. But you make a great point that it is ultimately a problem when sort of media sophistication, you know, aligns very, very strongly with an expensive college education. It's a real problem. I don't have a solution for it.
There is a lucky person from Slido because Matt wants to answer the question about the fact that in the US, every news source is politically driven. That's what the
well, I just don't agree. I just don't agree with that, right? And I just don't want to leave that one hanging. Like, I just don't agree with the idea that every news outlet is politically driven in the United States. I think that is one of the things that gets sold to you, not sold to you, gets sold to the public to make some sort of, you know, false equivalence between, you know, garbage misinformation and reported fact. Well, you know, they're all political, so, you know, you gotta pick your poison. I just don't believe that to be true. And I think that a simple look at the facts of, simple look at the front page of newspapers or the homepage of American newspapers will prove that that's not the case. Now, every time a reporter sits down to write a story, ultimately begins with some sort of subjective act, because it's a human being trying to figure out what is the most important salient fact to sit down and report today. But in a good news organization, that process is challenged by editors and second editors and copy editors and is updated as new sources, as new information comes to light. I just do not buy the argument that every news organization is politically driven. And I don't want to separate the idea of news and politics. If we're not covering the government, if we're not covering what our politicians do, then what are we even there for? I mean, run the comics and the funny pages and the crossword puzzle and we all go home. We have to cover the government. I don't want to separate them. But I don't think the facts would bear out the idea that we are politically driven.
Yeah, and I think that's very valid also for Slovakia. We heard this argument in quote fact that, you know, like every newspaper is politically motivated. And I am very glad you picked on that question. I would like to close down, although I saw one more hand there. Please, just ask your question.
Thank you. I'm just curious, how much time do you spend actually talking to sources, confirming their versions and so on, and then actually writing the article that wins the Pulitzer Prize? Like, what's the ratio? Thanks.
So, I mean, it's a good question, and it changes with the story. So I'm working on a project right now with 3 other reporters, and we've been working on it for about 4 months. And we probably spent 3 weeks writing the stories. There's a bunch of stories, writing the stories. And then they're in editing now. We're going to get edits back and we'll write them again. So, I mean, on a very long-term project, it can absolutely be months of reporting and a month of writing plus editing. But on a typical story, reporting is like breathing. You know, you're just out there doing the reporting every day, talking to people every day, collecting information, trying to understand the world that you cover. So it's not like you say, like, today I'm reporting. I might do 4 hours of reporting and be out on the streets and talking to people, meeting with people. I go to a press conference, I collect some documents, then I sit down and I write a story about what happened today. But all day long, I was collecting information that might not actually get into the paper for 2, 3, 4 weeks. So I think the idea is that reporting is like, it's a never-ending process, because ultimately we're trying to understand the world, right? You don't say, well, I'm only trying to understand the world today. Today I'm writing, and then tomorrow I'm trying to understand the world again. You're always trying to understand the world. Sometimes you have to sit down and write as well.
Matt, thank you so much for spending all this time with us and answering all our questions. Please stay for a while, because Matt Apuzzo will receive from Mr. Vice Rector Masaryk the commemorative medal of the university. And so please.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing your questions. And hopefully we will see you next time we bring a Pulitzer-winning journalist to Slovakia. Thank you.